Hi, everyone. My name is Leila Zegna. I'm so excited to be here. My most important job is being mother to Roya, our daughter who is 5 years old, who has Kabuki syndrome. She is our inspiration behind starting the Roya Kabuki program at Boston Children's Hospital, which you'll hear about more tomorrow. And she's also our inspiration behind our involvement at the Kabuki Syndrome Foundation. I'm also really excited to share the new crowdfund figure with you. So far, we have raised more than $20,000 from donors contributing to this annual campaign. This was catalyzed in the last couple of hours, in part by a very generous donation by Miller Jones Consulting, Jennifer Miller and Richard Jones. So a special thanks to you and to everyone who has contributed thus far. With the matched funds, that translates into more than $60,000 for the organization. Please do whatever you can to help us get that to over 100,000. This next segment highlights one of KSF's most important initiatives, and that's supporting centers of excellence. Johns Hopkins and Kennedy Krieger Institute are two of those names that are leading the way in Kabuki syndrome research. These centers are focused on improving diagnosis, early intervention and symptom management, and supporting patients with Kabuki syndrome worldwide. In this next segment, you'll learn more about the dedicated research programs for Kabuki syndrome at the Kennedy Krieger Institute. As the patient experience is at the center of all research efforts, Tiffany, a parent of a child with Kabuki syndrome, will provide a patient perspective of being involved in research at Kennedy Krieger. Here is a short video of her and her son, Nasir.
The Incredible Hulk, and I like Captain America.
He's happy, he's social, he's funny, he's engaging, he loves sports and music, and he's a great kid. We were living in Texas when Nasir was born. At birth, Nasir was extremely developmentally delayed, and at the time, we didn't know what was wrong with him. When we first came to Kennedy Krieger, my husband and I were in a total state of confusion. Nasir experienced significant challenges in almost every aspect of his development, and we had no idea what was going on with him and no idea where to begin helping him.
Nasir has a syndrome called Kabuki syndrome. It's a syndrome that I have a particular interest in, and I have been seeing him for many years now. Nasir is actually doing wonderfully. He was a very sick little baby and has come a long way into the dapper, wonderful preteen that you see now. One thing that Nasir is a perfect example of is the interdisciplinary approach. He needs multiple services from multiple different people, which he is able to receive all in one care team at Kennedy Krieger.
Nasir is the kid he is today because of the help from the professionals at Kennedy Krieger Institute. My hope for Nasir's future is that there will be some research development in terms of his cognitive abilities, that his team will come up with ways for him to live more independently.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Tiffany. That was really inspirational, and I'm just hoping I have the strength to go through this next introduction without getting too emotional. I now have this amazing, distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Jackie Harris, who you just saw in the video. She'll be speaking with Allison Kalinowski on addressing the current challenges in Kabuki syndrome. And this segment will highlight how research efforts at the Kennedy Krieger Institute are focusing on moving the field closer to clinical trials, specifically designing them to treat the neurodevelopmental aspects of Kabuki syndrome. Jackie Harris has been so instrumental in our efforts at KSF. Despite having young twins herself, she seems to find 25 hours in a day with which to support our efforts, be it around innovative research efforts at Kennedy Krieger, clinical trial preparation, liaising with members of the scientific and patient community. She is just a total and complete hero, and we are so, so grateful to her. Jackie, with that, over to you.
Hi, I'm Jackie Harris, and I'm going to be speaking to you a little bit about the research, but I wanted to turn it over to Tiffany first, who you saw her son in the video, and she is an amazing advocate for him, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about her experiences.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Tiffany Mathews Lay, and I am extremely excited to participate in today's conference and to share our story. As you've just heard, my son Nasir has Kabuki Syndrome. He is now 16 years old and driving me crazy as teenagers do. As first-time parents, my husband and I were not prepared to parent a special needs child. Nasir was very sick at birth, spending 6 weeks in the NICU at Texas Children's Hospital. After numerous examinations, genetic testing, and a few surgeries, the hospital gave us our baby and pretty much said, "We don't know what's wrong with Nasir." That feeling of helplessness was like nothing I've ever felt. It was at that moment that I called home to my mother in Baltimore and said, "We're bringing the baby home." If nothing else, she, Kennedy Krieger Institute, and Johns Hopkins could help us through this. So I quit my job as a budding drilling engineer in Houston, Texas, packed up the family, and headed north. The first visit with our pediatrician gave us a slight glimpse of hope. She immediately connected us with many of her colleagues in the Kennedy Krieger Institute and Johns Hopkins. There were many visits with specialists and therapists, but when I think of this moment in time, one visit in particular comes to mind. It was our first visit with Dr. Bjornson in 2005. At the end of our very comprehensive office visit, he looked at us and said, "I think Nasir has Kabuki syndrome." Of course, my husband and I looked at each other and were thinking, well, what in the world is that? To make a long story short, in 2005, genetic testing was not yet available for Nasir. We were advised to take him home, follow up with his medical specialist, and there were many, and parent him as we would a normal child. We were to receive a call in 2 years for genetic testing, and sure enough, we received that call 2 years later, and Nasir tested positive for Kabuki syndrome. Though I was devastated in the moment, the feeling of helplessness started to slowly reside after the positive diagnosis, after many therapies and interventions at Kennedy Krieger Institute, and after later discussions of research and potential medical advancements. We participate in research because we believe in science, specifically medical advancements through research. I have seen during my lifetime how medical advancements through research have changed the lives of millions. Examples that come to mind are treatments for HIV, AIDS, and cancer. There was a time not long ago when those diagnoses were automatic death sentences, but with the help of medical advancements through research, people with those diseases are living longer, healthier lives. It is because of medical research that we were able to return to Kennedy Krieger 2 years later to receive a formal diagnosis of Kabuki syndrome. It is our prayer that through continued research and associated medical advancements, people with Kabuki syndrome will have access to therapies and treatments that will improve quality of life and enhance life skills, ultimately providing for greater access to the communities in which we live. We participate in research because we feel honored to do so. Compared to many syndromes, Kabuki syndrome and associated medical advancements are fairly recent phenomena. As I mentioned previously, access to genetic testing wasn't available for our family until the late 2000s. We feel that medical professionals who currently research Kabuki syndrome are pioneers in the field. And as a family, we feel honored to assist in any way we can. We participate in research not only because medical advancement can potentially improve Nasir's quality of life and independence. We participate for those babies who have not yet entered the world. One day, neither I, my husband, nor Nasir will be here. It is our hope that our small contribution to research today will make huge impacts on the lives of others tomorrow. I am excited to see what the future holds for our children. We participate in research because we have a long-standing relationship with Kennedy Krieger Institute built on success and trust. We brought Nasir to Kennedy Krieger when he was 3 months old, and we've been there ever since. There are staff members at Kennedy Krieger who remember Nasir when he was an infant. But most importantly, we participate in research because we trust Dr. Jackie Harris wholeheartedly. Dr. Harris is Nasir's neurologist. She was a part of Nasir's genetics team many years ago. We met her well before Nasir started having seizures and had no idea at that time that she was a neurologist. Nasir started having seizures unexpectedly about 5 years ago. This is, without a doubt, one of the most difficult parts of our journey. He doesn't have them often, but when he does, they are pretty severe. After Nasir's first seizure, I reached out to Dr. Harris, not because she was a neurologist, but because we had developed a great rapport during genetics clinic, and I felt that she could guide me in the right direction. Lo and behold, during that call, she took Nasir on as a patient and asked the ER to forward his medical records. Since then, Dr. Harris has walked me through some very scary, very dark experiences relating to Nasir's seizures. She is my calm during the storm. We trust her. Nasir has participated in cognitive studies. He's had MRIs and EEGs in support of research efforts. He's also given blood on numerous occasions. Whenever Dr. Harris calls, we discuss it as a family, and we inevitably answer with an emphatic yes. Why? Because we believe in research. We look forward to bright, promising futures for people with Kabuki syndrome. And by the way, we love Dr. Harris.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. What a wonderful lead-in. I really, really appreciate that. And just to let you know, you all are the heroes. Everything that you have done for Nasir throughout time has been amazing, and he is such an amazing kid to show for it. And so thank you so much for sharing your journey. I know that everyone appreciates it. Thank you, Leila, for the wonderful introduction. And I would like to tell you a little bit more about neurodevelopment in Kabuki syndrome and what we know so far and where we need to go. And then I am going to turn it over to Allison Kalinowski, who's going to tell you a little bit more about how we are trying to get there. So one thing about research is that research has to be applicable to what patients experience day to day. We have to take that information from patients' clinical journey, apply it to research, study it, and then find a way to bring it back to the clinic again to impact lives and medical care for our patients. So when you're talking about the neurodevelopmental disabilities associated with Kabuki syndrome, it's important to understand a little bit about what neurodevelopmental disabilities as a term encompasses in general. So this term is a large term that basically means brain dysfunction that influences development. And so some diagnoses that can fall under this umbrella are intellectual disability, ADHD, autism, learning disabilities, cerebral palsy, language disorder, anxiety, epilepsy, and many, many more. When you are talking about neurodevelopmental disabilities and these individual diagnoses within, overlap and multiple disabilities are the rule, not the exception. So many kids have anxiety and intellectual disability, anxiety and ADHD, maybe a combination of all three. And this is just an example. It can be overlap of many different things. And so what is important to note is that these diagnoses are just descriptions of the specific difficulties in function related to the neurodevelopmental disability. And it is not that, you know, you got unlucky and your kid has 15 different things. No, your child has Kabuki syndrome. Kabuki syndrome causes brain dysfunction, and brain dysfunction can manifest in these different ways. However, although everyone is different, people struggle more with one thing, other people struggle more with another thing, we still know that some genetic syndromes have specific and known cognitive and behavioral profiles. And here are some examples of some syndromes where we're more familiar with what their profiles were. And when I started working in Kabuki syndrome, we really didn't have an answer for this for Kabuki syndrome. We didn't know what was the specific profile for Kabuki syndrome. And that was incredibly important to answer. And so, you know, as part of our work, we set out to discover and study and publish what is the cognitive and behavioral profile for Kabuki syndrome. And what we found was that the patients with Kabuki syndrome have specific deficits in visuospatial functioning. So reason, perception, construction, and memory, all in Kabuki syndrome, are significantly impaired in general as compared to their IQ matched peers and in comparison with their other functions. So their verbal functions, their verbal memories tend to be much, much, much higher than these other things. And this was extraordinarily exciting because it matched up with what was being seen in the mouse models of Kabuki syndrome that you heard Dr. Bjornson and his lab talk about earlier. And so from this, we've been able to start to build a cognitive and behavioral profile of Kabuki syndrome. Yes, there's intellectual disability, not so much language disability, that tends to be a strength. Visuospatial problems, absolutely. ADHD sometimes, anxiety, yes, and seizures plus or minus. Autistic features has a minus, while, you know, some kids with Kabuki syndrome can have autistic features. As we all know, our kids tend to be very social, you know, easygoing pleasers, except when the anxiety and things get in the way. And that's different than what you see in some other syndromes associated with autism. And so, great, we've been able to start to really hone out this profile through the research we've done. And that's very exciting, but why is it important? Well, it's important from two perspectives. One is the clinical care of patients. So when caring for patients, there are two things that having this knowledge can provide us. One is anticipatory guidance. So families want to know what's coming next. What is, you know, what are going to be the struggles and the strengths in kindergarten, in fifth grade, in high school, as an adult, right? And so understanding this within a syndrome can help us give this information to patients. And then it's important for this idea of genetic personalized medicine, right? So a child with Kabuki syndrome is not exactly the same as a child with another disorder that causes intellectual disability. And that's incredibly important. And so, you know, medicine should not be a one size fits all approach. And there should be specific treatment plans and therapy regimens and everything else tailored to an individual that is tailored both to that individual's strengths and weaknesses, but also to what we know about the disorder and what might be coming. The other piece that is incredibly important is building these kind of profiles and having this knowledge is important for scientific knowledge and research. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you're looking for a therapy to test something to make Kabuki syndrome better, right? You have to know, what does better mean? So what are people with Kabuki syndrome struggling with to begin with? And how can we measure that in order to improve their lives?
And that's what's known as outcome measures, right? What are we specifically measuring to say, does such and such intervention work to help? And so we have to know the baseline start, the profile of strengths and weaknesses, to know what to target to make better, to know what to use as outcome measures. And then it just helps us understand in general. You heard Dr. Bjornson's team talk earlier a lot about understanding the mechanism of the disease. So understanding the function of specific genes and proteins in both health and disease. And so building this kind of evidence can help us to understand that. And so we get back to, how do we do all this? So the first step is the clinical care of patients with Kabuki syndrome. So the way that we know to ask the questions for science and research that we know to ask is all based on seeing patients with Kabuki syndrome, lots of patients, seeing lots of patients and seeing them lots of times to understand what is most important to you all. What are the things that your children, your families, you yourself struggle with, and how can we best help with that? And so here in Baltimore, we see patients with Kabuki syndrome in two places. We see them at Kennedy Krieger Institute through the epigenetics clinic at Kabuki Syndrome Services. And we see them at Johns Hopkins through the epigenetics and chromatin clinic there. And I see all Kabuki patients in both clinics. And when in the epigenetics and chromatin clinic at Hopkins, my colleague, Dr. Farner, who is a clinical geneticist, also sees patients with me. And we see patients on a team approach, and she is also actively involved in Kabuki syndrome research. And then we have Elisa and Jackie, our genetic counselors at both locations. So then we take that knowledge that we see in the clinic and we work to apply it to research. And my specific area of interest is research, clinical trial design, and then implementation and carrying out of these clinical trials in Kabuki syndrome. And specifically within that, I am interested in clinical trials that tackle the neurodevelopmental aspects of Kabuki syndrome. Clinical trials are the way to get a therapy from an experimental idea to use in the clinic. And so everything throughout these 2 days, you're going to hear a lot of researchers talk about progress towards interventions in Kabuki syndrome. So progress being made toward therapies, potential treatments for Kabuki syndrome, and those are all incredibly exciting and more important than I could say. However, we don't know if any of those treatments work or are ever going to work without being able to test them in a clinical trial. And if we don't have a good clinical trial design, we are never going to see whether or not these treatments are truly effective. And it sounds pretty simple, but it's not as easy as it may seem. So a well-designed clinical trial has a specific patient population. Well, here we have that. We have clinical diagnostics for Kabuki syndrome. We have genetic diagnoses for Kabuki syndrome. We have epigenetic methods for diagnosing Kabuki syndrome. And we have all of you wonderful people who are here to advocate for your children, family members, yourself, and participate in the research. So a specific patient population, check. And throughout the conference, you're going to hear more from people who are working to improve diagnosis within Kabuki syndrome so we can be as inclusive as possible for this patient population. You need a therapy or intervention being tested. Well, that's what I was saying. You're going to hear a lot about it from in different segments, is looking for what is the intervention that we need to test to see whether or not it works. Then you need knowledgeable and collaborative teams. So you heard a lot about this in the last segment from Dr. Simpson and Serrano, and this is crucial. So knowledge for a rare disease like Kabuki syndrome, knowledgeable and collaborative teams are essential because this is a rare disease. Patients are located all over the country, all over the world. And we need, as someone asked in one of the questions, different centers carrying out either complementary or the same measures on the patients to get as many patients as possible and to get the best data as possible. And I'm really happy to say that with the help of all of my wonderful colleagues and with the extraordinarily help of the foundation of KSF, that we have started to be able to put together these teams. And we're working on multiple mechanisms to help these teams become a coordinated collaborative unit, and so that no one is working in silos and everybody is helping together. So more than what we can do at just Kennedy, Krieger, and Johns Hopkins, we could do even better with the help of all of our collaborators. This is showing collaborators around the country. We also have collaborators around the world who are invaluable. The other thing a well-designed clinical trial has are appropriate outcome measures. So what makes a good outcome measure? So a good outcome measure, it needs to be reliable. And so what that means is if, I test somebody here in Baltimore and Dr. Simpson tests somebody here there in Cincinnati, and we use the same measures, we want to know that we're going to get the same results. So reliable. We want them to be valid. So what valid means is that it actually reflects what we are trying to measure. So if we're trying to measure, visuospatial function, we want a measure that actually reflects that. And in addition, with validity, we want to know that the measure is not changing significantly over time. So beyond just, me testing someone here and someone else at another tester testing someone, we also want to know that if I test someone one day and then the next day I do the same test, that it's going to be roughly the same. Because if that is the case, then that means it's really measuring the function, and that when we later go to try and test an intervention or therapy, that we know that any change we see in that measure is actually due to the therapy and not just due to the fact that it wasn't a very good measure in the first place and that it changed. The measure needs to have variation. So what that means is just basically, if you're using it to test an intervention to see if it works, you need to know that there is actual wiggle room on the measure to actually see that improvement. And then again, the most important thing is it needs to have clinical relevance. So at the end of the day, if I measure some tiny little change in a blood value or tiny little change in an MRI, while those are incredibly important and crucial for biomarkers, which you're going to hear a little bit more about, they do not necessarily reflect the change in what really matters to the patients unless we first show that they do. So that's why all of this research, on the front end is so incredibly important to making sure the clinical trials really are measuring something that make a huge difference in the lives of our Kabuki syndrome population. So with that, I just wanted to acknowledge my funding sources